Hi everyone, welcome to the AI Radio Room. Today we're joined with Jason Morton, the founder of EZKL. How are you doing today?
Pretty well.
Good
How are
stuff.
you?
Doing amazing. You're the first person to ask that, so thank you. So do you want to tell us a little bit more about what EZKL does?
So at the core, there's a compiler that turns a AI model, TensorFlow PyTorch, into zero knowledge prover verifier. Our tagline is kind of developer friendly toolkit for verifiable AI.
Sure.
And then we support that however we can for building in decentralized AI and in DeFi and other applications.
Brilliant. Today we're going to talk a little bit about governance and legal issues within the space at the moment, right? Let's keep it kind of topical. The first question I'd like to ask you is regarding scraping of data. So a lot of the AI models that we see in the space nowadays are generally trained by public data, so data scraped from social media, things like this, right? So I want to know your opinion on whether it's ethical to use this data to train these models.
That's an interesting question. Whether it's ethical. I think in some sense the most practical question is whether it's legal in various jurisdictions and what happens as
But we'll get to that.
So ethically,
Just in your personal opinion.
in my personal opinion, I tend to think it's okay. I definitely think that we're remixing culture over time. It's sort of the same question that we addressed with a lot of what happened with copyright law in that led to the open source movement and copyright law around music, everything else. Typically, there is some kind of détente reached or some way to compensate people for the creation of things. And if you fail, of course, what the result is that it destroys the data sources, right? I think we saw that with journalism, where journalists weren't compensated for the reuse that search engines were able to monetize, and that partly destroyed journalism, right? Or it really cut the amount of funding for investigative research and everything else. And we're sort of seeing downstream effects of that. But I really think it's like an ethical question. It's almost like a mechanism design question. It's like, how do we want our society to work? How do we want public goods to work? I mean, I think in terms of public goods, one of the examples that I like to, which sort of rhymes with what's happening with AI, is you think back to 200 years ago, let's say, right? There wasn't really strong notion of copyright for recorded music. So there wasn't even recorded music, right? Or maybe even farther back. And so writing a song was a public good. It was uncompensated. There was no way to incentivize someone for writing a song, because once you wrote a song, other people could play that song, remix it and alter it. And we figured out a system for kind of retroactive public good funding of songs, which is copyright. And then you can have a stream of payments that goes towards the creator. You can imagine some sort of similar pressure solution coming for AI, right? So we have all the training material that's being created. We have no mechanism for compensating the creation of it. We don't really want to stop the intelligence around the remixing.
No.
But we want to make sure that the system as a whole functions.
Yeah. I mean, we don't want to stifle the innovation in the space as well by over-legislating almost, right? So let's talk a little bit more about what's happening in the space right now. For those of you who don't know at home, there's two companies that are recently involved in a key lawsuit. We've got Udio and Suno. So they're both text to audio companies, right? And what's happened is the big music labels like Sony and Warner Brothers, they're accusing these companies of using artist data to train their models, right? And it kind of brings up this issue of copyright, like you were talking about, right? Do you think that sort of lawsuit is a legitimate defense of artist rights, or does it cause issues with potentially stifling technological innovation?
Yeah, I mean, I think the intent is to stifle to some extent, in order to make sure that it's compensated. Or the extent is to try to find a different equilibrium where there's still incentivization of that creation, if we want it, right? I mean, maybe we don't care. Maybe we want to go back to a time when artists weren't compensated for their work, pre-copyright, right? Maybe that's where maybe we feel like movies are out of hand. We should roll back to theater productions that have no particular rights associated to them.
There's less convenience.
It's in a point of view. I don't necessarily think that's right, but maybe if it's cheap enough to create movies, it's not. By just talking to a model, it's not as critical to protect. It doesn't no longer costs $1 billion to make the movie. It costs 50 cents or something.
50 cents in a couple seconds too.
Yeah, right. To imagine and create. I think, of course, it is interesting to explore, maybe even step back and think, as a society, how do we want that to work?
Yeah.
Like, what incentives do we want? Is it about creator or human dignity, or is it about mechanism design? What are our objectives? I don't know the answer to that question, but I feel like we should not come up with a haphazard legal framework that is regulation by enforcement, which we don't like for lots of reasons.
Exactly. So let's talk a little bit more about infrastructure. Do you think there's a pressing need for infrastructure that's based on Web3 in AI? And or maybe do you think Web2 solutions are sufficient?
I think it really depends on on what we're trying to accomplish.
Just in general, in terms of
I think it's a tough question. There's definitely a lot of solutions coming up for Web3 based infrastructure. I think there are some serious challenges that need to be dealt with. The very simple version of that is we have data centers for a reason.
yes,
And so a straight naive approach where we say everyone's got to contribute their own compute that runs in a box in their house with a very slow internet connection is going to work, I think, because consumer hardware and consumer bandwidth is just not up to the task. That's fine. We've developed specialized data centers, incentivized mining of Bitcoin and Ethereum and other things, led to the development of specialized data centers that were matched to those requirements.
Yeah.
I think it's true that marketplaces are good at creating incentives and then creating optimizations. And so it may be a great tool to drive down the cost. I think one of the most compelling arguments that I've heard, as kind of a natural skeptic a little bit, as you can hear from that, is around not quite regulation, but not having too much central control by a government or by a particular firm over what people are allowed. And that even if it's more expensive to run in a decentralized way, that can lead to a greater explosion of innovation.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I guess a key supporting bit of technology for AI infrastructure is the verification of inference models in the space, right? And at EZKL use ZK proof technology to kind of bring that forward. Is that right? Aren't ZK solutions generally like quite complex and demanding? And does this introduce a degree of latency for verification in these inference models?
Yeah, so of course it introduces latency. They're mathematically complex, but they're operationally simple. So one of the reasons that I was attracted to ZK is that it doesn't require communication. Something happens, one entity can create this proof and then send it out. And so, if you look at something like a chatty protocol, whether it's optimistic or there's challenge response or there's MPC, anything that talks over the network, when you run it on one computer, it's so fast because it's inter-process communication, even a single piece of code. But then when you put it onto a network, suddenly you have to deal with repeated drop packets, you have to deal with latency, and you have this speed of light hard constraint on how fast you can go based on the number of round trips. So there's an explosion in the state machine. And so one of the things I like about ZK is that while the production of a particular ZK proof is difficult and potentially takes some time, the overall operational complexity of using it is very low. It's just do the thing. And the other aspect that, of course, I'm excited about is that there's a sort of a super Moore's law happening where on the order of 3% a day, up to 3% a day, is the improvement that we're typically seeing now in how fast ZK proofs run.
That's quite big.
It's quite big, and it adds up quickly.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd say 1 to 3%, but
Still
3% is actually
compounds.
held up pretty well. And you can look at state of the art, and that catches up to, even though there's a huge overhead, that shrinks that overhead very quickly.
Sure.
It's a little bit like, so I was part of DARPA deep learning program back in 2011 when these models were really a new idea. And one of the problems with them at the time was that there's overhead. They were a little bit slow compared to specialized things like hard feature based or like different specialized models for speech or image recognition, whatever else.
Yeah.
And they were not quite as good. They were pretty close, so they were not state of the art in anything, and they were kind of slow. And there's this question of, is this technology ever going to catch up? And of course it did, right? And it actually replaced a lot of those other things. And so to me, it's a little bit of a balance that, we're seeing exponential growth. There are places where you can go faster at the cost of communication now, but that on a longer time horizon, if that curve continues, there'll be nothing to worry about.
Yeah, we're very excited to work with you guys on the ZK solution for our verification at MagnetAI as well. Let's kind of bring it back to the governance and IP discussion, right? Who do you think should take the lead in setting digital governance policies? Do you think it should be dominated more by governments, or do you think maybe companies and...
What do you mean by digital governance?
So digital governance in terms of, You know, every single time there's like a technological advancement, there's obviously going to be governance issues and legislation issues, like with Web3, right? That's a classic one. So in terms of like the AI push, do you think it should be led by governments, or should it be like companies and private competition that leads this way?
So I'm concerned about involvement of the government.
Yeah,
I think there's certainly a role to play, and in some sense, it speaks for a broad variety of people. In practice, it tends to speak for fewer people than is advertised. Advertise it. Oh, this is the way we protect and speak for all of the people in a particular country.
Yeah.
But in practice,
Hidden
no, that's not
agendas.
the way it actually works in the sort of tactical day to day. The decisions are made by very few people. Bills are written, they're signed off on and voted by people who haven't even read them, and there's a lot of room for error. Of course, as someone in this space, in sort of the Web3 blockchain cryptocurrency space, one of the things that I love about it is that it's opt-in. You can go from, presence in this country implies consent.
Yeah.
To the enthusiastic consent of the governed.
Yeah.
Right? You've opted in to be governed by this system and follow those rules.
Yes.
And that means that there's greater opportunity for competing governance models to find the optimum, find the right balance, and when they find the right balance, attract the liquidity of ideas.
Is there maybe room for traditional Web3 governance in leading the way for legislation in this space then?
I certainly hope so.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I mean, I think to make mistakes, of course, but I think there's a really good idealism. I think there's a lot of people that are here for all the right reasons and see problems with the way governance has happened.
Yes.
See capture and everything else, and try to fix that. Right, like some protocols have anti-capture committees.
Okay.
Right, where their whole job is to try to prevent that from happening. Right, and it's a little bit different from corruption. Right. Yeah, so I hope that idealism plays a role. I hope that kind of marketplace of governance models helps us to explore and find a system that gets us to a better equilibrium.
Yeah. What EZKL has planned in the pipeline for the next 3 months? What have they got to be excited about?
Thank you. So a lot of what we do is very tactical. It's kind of, can we make the models faster?
Okay.
Can we make the system easier to use? Can we document it better? Can we fix every bug that someone finds for us, right? So that kind of loop is sort of how we live. We want to make customers happy and partners happy. We want to have people be delighted by the software. And so that's sort of our North Star. And so we're trying to follow what people want. I think that part of that is, of course, all of those things. Speed. I think we'll probably start to see more flexibility on the verifiability side to reduce deployment costs, because that's always, of course, an issue. Whatever other costs we can minimize. We're not going to have any big announcements. Our backend service will reach some kind of general availability, but we're sort of try to ship something every day.
Our implementation of your technology to look forward to as well, right? With our model store and our model network, you'll be able to interact with our models and be safely assured that all the data is verified, zero knowledge. Thank you very much for joining us, Jason. And thank you everybody at home for joining us for the Radio Room. We'll see you all again soon.